So, organizational line is kind of like an extended sketching process. A lot of artists, myself included, start drawings this way. You can use it as sort of like the underlying base layer for a drawing where you would add a lot of detail, or you can sort of do it as its own thing. It's related to sight measuring, but it relies a lot more on your intuitive sense of proportion. So, what I'm doing here at the beginning is I'm using very long lines that are simply indicating the placement of edges, and I'm kind of drawing connections from one object to another. So, the long vertical is sort of an estimate of where, like, the initially I thought the center line of the lamp would go. I end up moving it at one point, but that was what that was. I blocked in the edge of the wicker basket, and the shape of the bowl at the bottom. And then once I have those big things in, I do start sight measuring. So I want to make sure that my spaces, my negative shapes, there's a big negative shape in the middle of my subject. So I'm making sure that I get that negative shape the correct size and placement, because if I don't, I'm going to have to move my objects later. And then when I do the long lines, I keep them there. I don't erase them and clean them up as I go along. So like this one right here, I am comparing where the corner of the top of the seedling dome is to the bottom of the wicker basket below it. So I draw a lot of these really long measuring lines, and I use mostly horizontals and verticals, sometimes diagonals, but the horizontals and verticals I'm less likely to get wrong. So I held out my pencil, I measured where the corner was, and I just dropped my eye and the pencil down and compared it to the box. So when you're measuring your proportions, it's not necessarily like the height and width of the object. It's not how big is the object to itself, but where is its location relative to other things. And this way of drawing is really good for complicated things. So like I'm drawing the leaf, I am completely ignoring the leaf's relationship to the plant pot. What I did was I looked at the point of the leaf and I drew a vertical line down to the box below it to make sure that I was putting the leaf in the right spot relative to the box. Keep in mind as you work, like these are all temporary lines, they're all measurement lines, placement lines. None of these are what I would consider, even though the objects are starting to kind of like take shape, none of them are what I consider to be contour lines. I'm still working on general placement and proportion, and I'm keeping these lines really simple. I like to work mostly with straight lines, but you can do this technique with curved lines. I think straight lines might be a little bit better, but if you like to use curved lines, those work too. And then at a certain point, yeah, you kind of do need to get a little bit of detail. Just go darker. So try to avoid erasing for quite a while through, like maybe the first even 2 hours of the drawing. It's like you don't want to clean things up or erase kind of prematurely. If you're using a pen, all of those measurement lines will stay. You can just keep going darker and darker and darker, and you'll see the process of your drawing. So it can be kind of a quite interesting drawing at the end. It's almost like a drawing that is about the process of drawing. But then you need to sort of fix an object and do it with a little bit more detail, which is what I've decided to do with the bowl down at the bottom. So I'm thinking about a little bit of object construction here. I'm using the ellipse to get the shape of the bowl. I'm not really drawing it with detail, so there's lots of details in like the shape and the curve of the lid that I'm not thinking about right now. I'm still working on the overall shape and placement of the ellipse, which honestly, I'm going to go back to it again. I don't find ellipses to be any easier than anybody else. They're kind of a pain. They're difficult to do. So, I have to keep redrawing it until I get that ellipse to my satisfaction. And I want to do that before I worry about like the ins and outs of the curve of the bowl. And then as I move from here, all of my other contours, I'm going to relate it to the contours that are next to it, but I'm going to keep going back to the general principle of, where is this part of the object located to another object. So as I said, still working on the ellipse. You can start to think about line weight at this stage. So I'm going a little heavier at the front of the bowl and a little bit lighter at the back. So I did pull out my eraser. I got rid of my extra lines to clear it up. It was getting in my way. So the answer is, when do you erase things? When the lines are too confusing or they start getting in your way. So you want to leave them as long as you can, simply for the purpose of measuring and making smaller and smaller corrections. Because unless you need to move something wholesale, if you erase it, you can't tell where your previous line was. So when you make your correction, there's a good chance you're going to put it right back in the same spot. Um, and then here I am starting to get a little bit of detail of like the front and the back edge of the ellipse. So it's an ellipse inside an ellipse for the shape of the cover. It's a little wider at the sides, narrower at the back edge than it is at the front. And then I'm redrawing the center axis line. I'm redrawing a line to kind of block in where I think the center of the lamp is. So any cylindrical objects that you may have, make sure that you think about where that center axis line is so that you can get the shape of the contours on either side. I'm thinking about this where the full ellipse is, and I'm kind of tracing it off the paper to help me with the shape of it because I've cropped the object. It goes off the edge of the paper. If you struggle with something like that, I don't show it in this video. I think I show it in my basic sight measuring video. But you can take a piece of paper and put it right next to the page, tape it there, draw the whole object, pull the paper away, and chances are that the curve of your ellipses will look better than if you hadn't done that. So sometimes a cropped cylinder can be kind of tricky getting the curves just right. And then as I did the shape of the lamp, so I've sped it up so you don't have a super long video. As I did the shape of the lamp, what I did was I looked at all of the, like this line here going across, I am trying to figure out where the contour turns, and I'm doing that by relating it partly to the base below, the base of the lamp, but also the sketchbooks in the box across. So I'm trying to figure out where's that break in the contour, where does it turn. I looked across, where does it line up with the sketchbooks, and then I looked down, where does it line up with the bottom of the lamp, and that helped me with those proportions a lot. And you can do that, like hold your pencil out if you can't see it, but if you do this technique a lot, you can just see it with your eye. You don't even have to hold your pencil out. All right, so I'm like, okay, it lines up with the bowl here. I did something wrong, so I'm moving it over. And then before I'm ready to start thinking about actual contours, I need to go in and like erase all of my smudges, clean things up. Basically, just get back to white paper where I think I need the white paper. So you can be a little bit strategic about this. Sometimes when you start erasing, you don't necessarily want to erase everything. So with graphite, the smudges have become sort of like this like light gray across the entirety of the paper. So if I start to erase areas that I want to be lighter and I leave the more gray areas, it actually, instead of looking like a dirty, messy, now I don't clean up this drawing a lot. I do have a finished example that I'll add on, but it just becomes a light value, and then I can go in with my eraser and clean up basically any smudges that I don't want. Right here I'm moving my plant over. My plant was in the wrong spot. Um, So I went through the whole drawing. I remeasured everything. I used slightly darker lines so that I actually can see, this is those are contours. I've made the decision about where my objects is. I've rechecked my measurement. Everything is in the same spot. Um, and then this is the stage where I go through, and now that I'm happy with the placement of the edges of the major objects and shapes, it's I don't have any of the smaller details, but I know that I'm not going to be making any big changes. I just erase all of the smudges, especially in the foreground, because I want more contrast in the foreground. And then I'm going to go back through. I think I'm using a 6B pencil here, so with a heavier line. If you're using a pen, you can switch to a darker pen. If you're using a charcoal pencil, it's much like graphite. You can simply go with a thicker line, a darker line. You can use a softer charcoal pencil. But with graphite, I switched to a 6B pencil, so it's darker, and I'm pushing down a little bit more firmly and harder, so that out of all of the messy kind of smudges, I can go in and pull out my contours. And once you have your details, your objects blocked in, how much detail you put in it. Some of it depends on how quickly you draw. I've said to spend about 6 hours on this drawing, so it's not a fast drawing. If you draw quickly, you can end up putting a lot of detail in this, but be selective about it. So, um, sort of think about it kind of like atmospheric perspective. You want more detail, more texture, darker lines, things that are in the foreground. You can bring them forward by going darker with more detail. You can also create a focal point. So a lot of times with a drawing like this, I will not define my edges. I won't draw all the way up to the outside edge of the paper. I may or may not decide to finish the lamp. I might say, well, I kind of like the hard edge, and I'm going to leave the lamp a little less undeveloped. It's going to sort of stay there at the outside edges, or I might go back in with more detail.